All right, bunch of people joining. Okay, everybody, welcome. Okay, I see some familiar faces who we had on the last call. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sweet. Give me 2 seconds. I'm gonna connect everything, so make sure we're live on YouTube. And where's the link?
Here you go.
I know, but I want the link to put in here.
Oh.
Let's kick this off. First of all, welcome and thank you for coming. Let's kick this off in the chat. Why don't you guys all drop a note in there and let us know where you're joining us from. And if you have a beverage, I just finished feeding my baby, so I'm having a little glass of wine. What are you drinking? It could be water, wine, coffee, tea. I don't know, your quarantine beverage of choice. So yeah, where you're from and what you might be drinking if you're having a drink, or if it's your favorite drink if you're not. And
I'm on my like 4th cup of coffee today.
4? Is your heart not like exploding out of your chest?
Oh, it's the only way I can survive.
Oh my gosh. Once I stopped drinking coffee when I was pregnant, I haven't gone back because I realized that it actually gives me a lot of anxiety and I feel a lot better without it. So I just
Really?
drink half now. Yeah, it's been great. Okay, cool. Let's see, Toronto, Maui, South Florida, Australia, Colorado, Massachusetts, San Francisco, New York, Atlanta, Minneapolis, New Jersey, Tulsa, Oklahoma. A wine spritzer, yes, Michelle, a wine spritzer, yes, you are my gal. Wine spritzer is like my summer go-to drink. I swear, I'm an old lady at heart. All right, you guys, let's dive in. Thank you so much for coming. We are hosting these events just as a way to get everybody together and learn and have fun. Super casual. Here's what we're going to do. Xochil is here with us today. She's amazing. She has been on the Successful Fashion Designer podcast. I will drop that link in the chat if you want to check it out. But she's very knowledgeable in the industry, technical design, pattern maker, so on and so forth. So you can learn a lot more about her on her podcast episode that she did. But for today, as you guys know, we're gonna do a live fitting session, which I'm super excited because that's something we cannot do on a podcast. And so to start, Xochil, why don't you introduce yourself? And then she's gonna go through some fittings on her mannequin. And then we do have some questions that a lot of people send in advance. So we will go through those first. And then you can also drop questions in the chat as we go, and we'll gather up those and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. So that being said, Xochil, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? And I always feel like I'm saying your name wrong, just a teeny bit wrong. So please clarify.
Yes. Thank you, Heidi. My name is Xochil Herrera Shear, and I have a company called the Chicago Pattern Maker. We do product development services for mainly small businesses, startups, brands, designers, and we help them from tech packs, tech design, sometimes helping them with sourcing either fabric or factories. And then we work with them through pattern making, prototypes and fittings, getting that all the way revised and at scale.
Hold on real quick. If you guys can all make sure to leave yourself muted. You should have all come into the meeting muted. I'm going to go ahead and mute you all again. But if you can just make sure to not unmute yourself so that we don't hear you or any background noise you might have going on, that would be fantastic. All right, go ahead.
Cool. So as I was saying, we do product development services and basically help them get from the design concept all the way through their final prototype. Then we work with a partner for grading and marking services, or we send them to the factory, which might be doing the grading and marking. So our core business is the product development. Prototyping is a big part of that. And so we usually do fittings, mainly on real people is what I like to do best. But since we're doing virtual things and a lot of people start their designs on a mannequin, it is a good tool to kind of work through the beginning parts of the design process. But just want to make sure I note that if you can fit on a live model, definitely do that before anything goes into production. So I guess that said, should we dive into some of the styles I brought today?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Move myself over here. Okay, so I have a few things I pulled. Obviously, we work with designers during product development, so I didn't want to share anything that we're currently working on. Let me get camera situated so you can see all of me here. Okay. So I brought out a few things that are like way old in my closet. Some things I've made, some things are retail, but just some kind of basic items that we can work through. First one is a dress I designed when I was first starting my freelance career. So this is about 12 years old, where I designed the dress, did the tech pack for it, did the pattern prototype, and this was kind of the final prototype. Obviously my skills, like anyone, should hopefully be better than they were 12 years ago. So there's some things I think I would still perfect about this design. And so I'll just walk through first, I guess, what the tools are when we do a fitting. I like to use little magnetic pin cushions. I can put it on my wrist versus having to find pins all around the room. If I'm working on a live fit model, I'll usually give them the options of whether we want to use safety pins versus straight pins. On a mannequin, I think it's easier to just stick with the straight pins. So I'll grab some of those. You'll definitely want your tape measure. I should back up a little bit before we even do a fitting on a person. We're always measuring the garment against the technical specs to see if we were on spec, if we were off. Before we make any changes, though, we still do the fitting. That way we can decide whether we're going to change something to match the spec or change something to revise the spec in the tech pack. So that is where we'll start. In terms of wear on the garment, I like to start from the bottom down. So the first place I'm looking is kind of the neckline, the shoulder line. I want to make sure that the shoulder line especially is balanced. I'm going to grab the camera and see if I can give you a better idea of what I'm looking at here. So I want to make sure, let's see, check my screen here. Okay, that our shoulder line is, forward, because your shoulder line should not be like halfway between. It should be slightly forward. Just like a person's shoulder naturally is. But on your mannequin, you do have a shoulder line. So to make sure that's following all the way to your shoulder point and that that's balanced. You're not having an angle one way or another. It's not too far forward or back, unless that's something like an on-purpose design, such as a dropped shoulder line or a yoke, for example. The other thing I want to check is my shoulder point, that this is hitting. If I was doing it on my body, it would be more on my bone where your arm pivots. On the mannequin, this one I don't have an arm on her, so I'm looking for just like the very edge of her shoulder. So I know that this is actually too wide for her shoulder, and so I'm going to pin that out, but also measure what I'm pinning. And so there we go. Okay. So I'm pinching it out so that her sleeve now is at the correct shoulder point. When I'm recording the measurements, it's important to note whether you're measuring a folded distance or a total distance. That way, when this goes back to the pattern and we're actually going to fix it, then we want to make sure the correct measurements and correct revisions happening in your pattern. So I'm going to blend this, and I'll do another close-up in a second, but blend this back into the armhole. So I'm going to also note like where it goes back to 0, meaning I'm taking out from the shoulder, but where does it blend into the same original armhole, front and back? So I'll measure that, and I'll note that my folded measurement is a 1/2 inch, so my total intake from the shoulder point was 1 inch. You can record that however you want, but again, it's important to note which way that you were recording that. And then I'll note that my back armhole blends to 0 at 6 inches from the back shoulder. And for the front, it's blending to 0 at 5 1/4. So now I've done that. I'm going to recheck my neckline to see if what I changed here has affected anything else. It does look like my back neck, and some of this is because she's a mannequin and not a person, but there's a little bit of a pinch happening at the back neck. So I want to make sure to take that out next. I'm dropping her back neckline just because it's poking out away from the body at 1/8 of an inch. And then I'll blend that back into the armhole, or excuse me, into the neckline. So coming back around to the front, I want to take a look here. Is there any gaping that's happening? There is a little bit at the princess seam here. And I want to keep my style line as this kind of curved piece. So I want to keep that pinching out so that you're not getting gaping around the chest, around the neckline. This again would be something a lot easier to fit on a real person, because mannequins are very stiff. Real women either have, fatty tissues, or they might have a hollow place here. So you're going to fit for different types of bodies or even different age groups and how their body is. But we're going to pinch that out, and then I'll record the measurement. A lot of times in fittings, I should mention, I like to have a second person with me, an assistant who's the person who's recording all the measurements. That way I'm not going back and forth to record everything, but certainly you can do it yourself, but it is nice when you have an assistant. So I did a folded measurement of 1/4 inch here and blending it 1 1/4 inches to nothing into that princess seam. The next place I want to look is on the sleeve. And obviously if we had a person, we'd be able to see, like, is this tight across her bicep? Where it's ruched and gathered into this kind of bell design. Is that hitting where I want according to the design? Do we need to shorten it or change the gather ratio? We'll also want to kind of pay attention to seam finishings, and if something is laying weird here, maybe it's looking at a top stitch to fix it, or maybe this tension or something like that is wrong on the machine, and that's a note to put in the tech pack for the sewer to pay close attention to. But assuming we like kind of the design of the sleeve after the shoulder change, then we don't have to note anything there. We do want to check kind of the underarm, make sure it's dropped enough below your armhole so that it's not too tight. You have range of motion depending on the design, and but it's not too tight up against like the armpit. Again, on a model, it's a lot easier because you're gonna obviously ask the person too, how does this feel? I guess moving down the garment, the next thing I notice is the waist. This is obviously kind of a baby doll sort of silhouette, so it is going to come away from the body, but I notice that on the waistband yoke, which is an all-in-one piece for the front and the back, it's coming a little bit away from her body. I'm trying to show that. Coming a little bit away, so we want to add kind of a dart allowance by pinching out the material to make that flat against her stomach. However, we don't want to change the design So instead, this is going to get kind of slashed and spread out of the pattern, but it's still something we need to communicate in the tech pack when it goes back to the pattern maker. If you are the technical designer, or if you are the pattern maker, noting it for yourself and taking this out as a dart and then putting it back together so that the design stays the same. Sometimes though in fittings, we do discover an extra seam or removal of a seam is something that the designer actually wants. But usually we want to focus on the fit and the functionality of the garment, less so than the design. So it's easier to take that away into a separate meeting versus spending time with doing that during the fitting, especially if you're paying for your fit model.
So can I interrupt you really quickly? Simone asks, can you shed some light on what blending a measurement to zero means? Can you
Yes.
quickly talk about that?
Okay, so when I was talking about the armhole, but really it can refer anywhere on the garment, blending to zero refers to blending back to the original seam. So if I'm taking some allowance out here at that center front princess seam, I'm going to blend it back to the original seam at some point. Unless it's very large, maybe I'm taking it like all the way down to the next seam. But in this case, I just took it right at the neckline and I want to blend it back to the original seams. That's what blend to zero means, is where's that 0 point? Okay. So going back to, waistband, we've got that. A decision that we would want to make on a dress like this is because we're taking in this allowance, does that material come all the way out of the skirt, or do we want to keep the skirt the same and now it's going to be a little bit more heavily gathered, you have a higher gather ratio since your waistband's smaller. So that'd be a design decision for someone to make. So now we've really covered the front of the garment here. We can come to the back and kind of see how there's shoulder darts here, back waist darts here. Hopefully this is all showing up pretty well in the video. So I want to take a look at how the darts are laying. These I see are a little bit puckered on the end, and that could be either from a sewing error or that could be from a pattern error. If it's happening on only one side, it's more than likely a sewing thing. But if it's happening consistently on both sides, it's probably a pattern thing. Either way, that's something you want to note as you're fitting. I'm going to shift her over only because I've been fitting only on one side of the garment. So I want to make sure that I'm fitting on the same side. So I've done this side of the front. I want to stay on the same side. Otherwise, any of these revisions that I did here are not showing up over here. So this dart, I'm deciding I'm going to make it a 1/2 inch longer just so that this blends more smoothly. I'm going to probably just say the same thing with the lower dart. There's a little bit of drag happening here that's pulling toward the dart. That means I can probably afford to take, maybe I want to change this into a princess seam, maybe I don't, but there definitely is excess material here. And once I pull that into the dart, you can see these drag lines, these wrinkles have kind of gone away. I'll do a close-up of that because I don't know how well that's showing far away. Okay, so right now it's relaxed, not pinned in at all in this waist dart, but we see there's these kind of wrinkles happening towards the side seam. But once again, this isn't even pinned yet. Once I've pulled that into the dart allowance, a lot of that material is now smooth. And a lot of times when you're trying to decide to like, where do you want that excess to go? Should it be taken into the side seam? You can pull it and see that actually creates more wrinkles. So it's definitely a better decision to take it in the dart here. The same revision that I made to that front waistband where this waist is definitely jutting out away from her body. And if I want a nice tighter waist, I'm going to take in, again, like dart allowance onto the waistband and remove that. I will do that. Do we have any more questions, Heidi, about this dress?
Nothing. We've got some questions coming in, but I'm adding them to the queue for the end.
Okay.
Sony or Sunny, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Do you have a flat for this dress? And Kenny kind of, someone else also, I think it was Kenny, asked, like, do you have a flat sketch that you then sort of go and mark your measurements on, or do you use a your POM chart?
So I usually use a POM chart. It is nice to have the flat. Always after fitting, once I've got all the pins in, I also take photographs of the garment on the model, or in this case, on the dress form. That way we can see how it lays when the person is standing, take any zoomed in places, and then we'll mark it up in Illustrator so that we can highlight, especially on a dark garment like this. This is not an ideal color to be fitting in, especially when you photograph it. And as you can see on video, it's hard to see all those little seam lines. So that's why typically people start in a light color, a white or a lighter color in their prototypes. That way you really see everything that you need to see. But either way, we'll take photographs and then we'll mark, okay, here's what we're taking in. The top of the waist fit great, so there's nothing to be taken in here, but on each of these fold ins, I'm taking in a 1/2 inch folded. So that's an inch, 2 inches total on that back waist. So that's good for the technical designer or the pattern maker, whether you're sending this back to a factory or whether you're sending it back to a pattern maker or whether it's you yourself. It's good to have those images to refer back to, and also to give yourself like tracked changes between each fitting. You're going to have multiple fittings definitely on each and every garment that you design.
Yeah, that's great. Emma, I'm sorry if I'm hoping I'm getting some of your names right, and maybe your screen name is not even your actual name, or maybe it is. Emma says, do you only need to pin both sides of the waist just to make sure that the adjustments are evenly distributed? Is there anywhere else that you would pin both sides?
Definitely on the waist. Anything that's a circumference, I would do both sides. In the case of the dress, yes, I can go back to the other side, pin it, and then compare measurements. And if you know that your model has, which we all do to an extent, but if you know your model has like one shoulder that's a little bit higher than the other, it might be good to pin both sides and then take the left and the right measurement and average them before making the adjustment. Obviously, we're doing a real quick one here, but in a lot of cases, if I can see that they're equal, I'll save time and just pin one side of like the shoulder, for example. But yeah, the waist, if I were only pinning out one side, I'm really just shifting the problem one direction. So it's better to pin both, make sure it's equal. Also, when I'm deciding whether to take it out from the side seam or whether to take it out from the center, it's better to pin and see what happens when you do one versus the other.
Okay, that's great. And just so you guys know on the questions, I'm gonna try to toss in ones that are really relevant to what Xochil is doing right now, and then other ones I'm gonna save for later. So if I skip your question, don't take it personally. So Jaylene says, how do you allow for movement in the cross back when you're fitting on a mannequin? It looks like on this dress, on a real person, they might not be able to bring their arms forward.
Yeah, and honestly, from knowing this dress that I made 12 years ago, it is tight across here. What we would want to do is compare it back to the cross back measurement in the tech spec. On the mannequin itself, since she does not have an arm, usually I just take it so that the seam is going a little bit past where the edge of her arm is right here. This is coming kind of right to it. This fabric also does stretch, so there is a little give. But again, another reason it's good to fit on a real person versus the mannequin. You can get pretty close, but there's certain things you can't do.
Great, thank you. And
Yes.
then we have some questions about the volume on the bell on the sleeve. How would you measure that, and sort of if you wanted to adjust that on this specific type of garment?
So if I was going to make like a larger, like more voluminous bell, for example,
Sure.
maybe, okay. So this one, yeah, definitely has fewer gathers in comparison to how gathered the skirt is. That was kind of a design choice, not to have a huge, huge sleeve. But if I wanted to add more, usually what I do is take the circumference measurement from the sleeve, and then depending on the fabric, how heavy it is, and also how voluminous I want it, I'll do like times 1.5 or times 2, or maybe if it was chiffon, I might do times 3 or more to have, like, let's just say the bicep's 13 inches and multiplying that by 2. So this is 26 inches in circumference. Depending if I want the pattern to be the same on the bottom versus the top, you know, obviously that can change your pattern piece. But mostly I go by ratio in terms of like how gathered it would be. If I notice like, oh, this really isn't enough gathers, or I want to concentrate my gathers, better example, I want to concentrate like on the shoulder, I want to concentrate my gathers so it's only on the cap of the sleeve and not all the way around. Want to mark with notches obviously on your pattern, but we might say, you know, these gathers are starting and they start at 5 inches from the front shoulder. We want to start at 3.5. So let's move all these gathers up towards the top. That way it's more concentrated on the cap at the shoulder versus all around.
And then one question came in specifically about working with woven fabrics as opposed to knits. Beth asked, do you always use full measurements for wovens?
I always use full measurements for wovens. I'm totally sure I understand the question.
I guess I'm thinking maybe like full, like on the round as opposed to half. I'm not sure if that's what you mean, Beth. Can you clarify that? And then let's see, I think, okay, so we'll go to this question from Stacy, who says, I have a ton of issues with armholes and sleeves. Mainly the model can't lift their arms or has limited mobility. Any tips or tricks for armholes and sleeves specifically, which I think in a garment like this would definitely be something you want to pay attention to.
Yes, and I'm gonna switch to the button-down blouse, so we can see another couple of styles, and this also has a sleeve, so that'll be a good one there.
Okay, perfect. And then Beth clarified, yeah, so the whole circumference measurement as opposed to measuring half. Always use the full circumference on a woven.
At least on a tech pack, it's something, I feel like the tech designer often has half measurements because you're measuring the garment flat and not on the body. But as a pattern maker, I'm, you know, reading those measurements, those specs, doubling them where I need to. If I'm making, let's say, a blouse, I have the half measurement, but it's a symmetrical style, so I'm building a quarter of it, so then I'm dividing it again. But in terms of like how to measure on the spec sheet, I think most of the time flat is appropriate because that's how you're measuring the garment. Sometimes, I guess if you're measuring like a sweep, it might be along the hem, for example. But as long as they're clearly indicated that, especially for like a sleeve opening or anything, that it's measured flat or measured along the seam or along the circumference, either is okay.
And then quickly, while you're buttoning that new outfit up, CJ asks, I'm looking to buy a professional dress form or mannequin soon. If you only had one size to work from, what size for ladies do you think is the best?
I think that's a personal decision based on your brand, whatever size sample that you're making. Every brand I recommend doing the medium size for your brand. So if that's a 6 or if that's a 10, whatever your sample size is, your mannequin should be as well. I think if you were doing like custom apparel, maybe it's like something that's in the middle of your customer base as well, so that you could pad it larger if you need to, or see a design and then kind of self-grade it smaller for people. This one's a size 6, which is really kind of like a size 2-4. Although I think if I were buying a mannequin today, I'd probably buy a little bit bigger. But I think it's a personal decision based on like what your brand is.
Okay, that's great. All right, let's dive into this this garment. And you guys, I'll remind you, if I'm not asking your question right now, I am saving them and we will try our best to get to them at the end. So just please note that I'm not ignoring you.
Awesome. Okay, so this one is a sample, again, from, I want to say like probably close to 10 years ago, very early on in my career. So there's, again, this was for a brand. I don't remember which prototype it was, but I don't think it was the very final one. So in any case, it is a button-down blouse. There are no darts. It has a roll-up sleeve. And then again, no darts in the back either. So it's a very like kind of loose tunic-y style. And not a full sleeve either. So right away, let's assume that I do want this to be more fitted because it's kind of a baggier shape right now. I want to talk about like how to add a dart into something that maybe you didn't put a dart in the design, but you put it on and it really needs it. This would be probably one of those cases. You want to find your apex level, which is like the fullest part of your bust. Bring that kind of measurement over to your side seam. And then you might drop it down because usually your bust darts are not completely straight across, but just to kind of give yourself a few measurement points here. I'm gonna bring her closer so I can show you a little bit better. Another cool tool that I think people should have in their toolkit when they're doing fittings is this tape. It's draping tape. I got this from Wawak, which is like a sewing supply company. They sell thread and pressing supplies, pattern making supplies, stuff like that. But it's also called like graphic design tape. It's really skinny, 1/8 inch wide. You can get black or red, maybe other colors, but those are kind of the ones that come the most handy, I feel like. And you can use this if you're draping a design, or you can also use it during a fitting. If you're like unsure about where to add a style line. So before we pin anything out, I might use the tape to see what that bust dart might look like. So I'm going to drop it something like that. And I'll pull her away so we can see what this does to the rest of the garment. Because obviously pinning out dart allowance, we'll have to like redo the entire side seam on the pattern. But we do want to see this drag line that's kind of happening here, this wrinkling that's happening here. If I take out a dart, I want to pinch just enough that it's straightening where it hangs from the bust level and see how much that is. I can see that definitely has a more smooth shape here. And I haven't even pinched out the entire dart yet, but just pinning out right at the side seam so far. So I'll finish pinning out the dart here. Let's see what that looks like. In terms of a pattern revision, if you find that you're pinching out like more than 2 inches, that might be way too much, that maybe there's somewhere else that excess material can come from. Maybe it's coming away from the center front, maybe it's adding a center front dart instead, or maybe it's pinching it here, but then in pattern, kind of removing it out of the armhole or somewhere else. But this looks pretty smooth, again, in comparison to the other side here, where it's just kind of baggy under the arm, baggy at the bust. this gives it a more tailored silhouette. Okay, so we would do the same thing as we did before though, like kind of starting from the top down. I like the shoulders already pretty balanced, but maybe I feel like this collar is a little bit too wide. So I want to find out if that's the collar or the collar stand. More than likely it's your collar stand. Let's see if I can get a good angle here, maybe. I'll raise my camera up. Just a sec. Makes me wish we weren't in quarantine. I'd have like a cameraman. Okay. So take a better look at this neck here. It does seem like it's coming away from her neck quite a bit. When I pull down, you can see, you know, there's quite a bit of space around the neck. Maybe that's intentional, but let's say that it's not. There's a couple ways to address it. We could take out from like the back neck, and maybe there's just a dart that needs to happen sort of out here, but I can see that doesn't really correct the front of the neckline as much. So it's actually going to be making that across neck measurement smaller. This is a little bit difficult to pin because you're pinning into the collar stand, and it's not going to lay 100% correctly, but you can kind of creatively fold and pin this out to see what the correction would look like once it's made. A correction like this, you're definitely going to be recutting a new prototype and making sure that this, you know, fix the issue for you. You can kind of see, even though there's the bulk of the pin right there, that this is hitting closer to the neck just by moving the shoulder point closer to the neck. So in this case, I moved it 3/4 of an inch in toward the neck. So that changed your measurement as well as your neck circumference.
On neck measurements, Ale asked, what would be a good allowance for the collar or neck width? For example, being able to fit about a finger around?
Yeah, I'd say comfortably you want to fit like 1 or 2 fingers. So like if your collar is fully buttoned, that you can stick in 1 or 2 fingers. That way you can kind of move your neck, you not having difficulty swallowing or, you know, sitting comfortably for a long period of time. And maybe it's, you know, if it's not a collared shirt like this and it's a funnel neck, like maybe you want an exaggerated neck for some design purpose. But for something like this, I think this slimmer silhouette, there's still room in the collar, but it's not sitting so far away from the neck that it's weird. Okay, so if I did make this change, this is another thing I would want to show on photographs and redrawing in Illustrator, my new collar, because the collar point is the same and maybe my center back is the same, but we need to know how to treat the shape of this. I'll try to get another close up here, because once I've pinched this out, we're left with kind of an awkward angle, and we want to make sure that this is shaped nice and smooth the same way that the opposite side is currently. Okay. So this style's already looking a lot better on the front and on the neck. So we'll take a look at the back. Now in this case, we have created the bust dart over here, which creates this excess wrinkle in the back. The way to correct this, we'd have to actually split the seam open and adjust your side seams so that they're balanced again. So if we're taking out, let's say 1.5 inches almost total from the front, that's going to have to come out of the back too. We can't just have excess material here. So your pattern adjustment, you'd split open the entire side seam and then rebalance those. But in this case, I'm going to look at the opposite side just so this is not distracting me for the fit over here. So maybe we'd like how full this is. There is a little pleat at the back, but maybe it's not enough of a pleat. A very tiny pleat back there. And maybe the fullness is okay as long as, you know, this is adjusted. Maybe we decide we want to add, you know, vertical darts to shape the waist and the back. This is something where I'll pin both sides and compare the measurement back and forth to each other, because it's near impossible to get your level exactly right and to get like your dart intake exactly right. So it's a little easier to pin out both sides and then adjust where exactly they're hitting. Another trick actually is if you're having trouble figuring out like where someone's natural waist is you can either use elastic or twill tape and kind of tie it around their waist and make sure you're getting the level exactly right. On a person, even if they don't have a very defined waist, this is still a good way to find it, especially with the elastic actually. So it'll kind of naturally settle once you move around into that pivot point on your waist where like you bend over. So I want to mark where that level is, and then I'll take the tape away just so it's not altering my fit. But so that'll be where the largest dart intake will be is at the natural waist. And then I can kind of decide how far up and how far down I would like to go with that. Usually this is hitting kind of the high hips so that you're not going all the way down through. So this is again a tunic style, so we don't want to go into the hip, the full hip, but just kind of right before that starts. And kind of mid back, not above the armhole. And then I would take these measurements, both length from the high point shoulder down to where we're starting, length of the dart intake, and also from the dart intake from the top of the dart to that midpoint, what are all those lengths? Take that measurement for both sides, and then I can decide how close they are or get the average between them. I might also, if I pin this, maybe I pin too close to the side seam here and too far in here on the pattern, we can obviously adjust and make sure that like it's exactly equal from the center back, that we don't have lopsided darts. So that is.
Hey, Xochil, real quick on a couple questions specifically to this. Jaylene asked, where on the back would you take out to rebalance the side seam?
So to rebalance the side seam, I normally we'd take apart the entire side seam because we're not taking this dart from the back, we're only taking it from the front. So once I release that side seam, the back is going to be, let's see if I can angle this a little bit, is going to be 1.5 inches longer at the hem. So we would take that 1.5 inches off of the hem at the back and then blend it to the center back. We don't want the center back length to change. And again, that's for taking something that had no dart and adding the dart into it. If you felt like that was changing your side seam too much, you might kind of meet it halfway and add the material back into the hem of the front, or add it half to the front and take away half from the back. Again, so you get a balance between the two, making sure your front side seam and your back side seam are equal. Some other things that are hard to do on a mannequin, but we'll kind of quickly talk through, is things that you'd want to evaluate as far as the cuff circumference. This is a pretty wide cuff, but the style is meant to be rolled. So that's kind of on purpose, but maybe that's something that you're adjusting. You know, you can obviously pin out to make it smaller. Maybe it's adding a pleat if you don't want to change the circumference of the bicep or elsewhere on the sleeve. And again, taking measurements from the sample, comparing it back to your spec. You also want to pay attention to things like I don't know, buttonhole placement. If there was gaping, let's say if she was a much bustier girl and you had some gaping here, maybe it would be a matter of adding more material, or maybe it would just be strategically changing the placement of the buttonholes to prevent the gaping from happening. You know, talking about top stitching and things like that as well, or seam finishes are always part of the fitting as well. So I'll switch this out to a t-shirt because I know there were a couple of people who wanted to see t-shirts and knits.
So while you're changing that out, we had a couple questions about virtual fitting. So is this typically how you do your fittings virtually? And how does this work for your clients, or what's your experience with that?
So I do have a lot of remote clients. It's always excellent when we can do fittings in person. For remote clients, often we're fitting either on them, where I'm seeing them on video, or we'll hire a professional fit model so I can still fit on a live person, and then they would video in to see kind of direct what changes they want to see on the design or how it's functioning. Sometimes because it's virtual, we might do that in kind of multiple stages where we'll try it on here, either on a mannequin right now, since I can't see a fit model, or we might do a fit model virtually. Actually spoke with one of the modeling agencies we work with, and they mentioned a lot of the big brands are hiring the models to do virtual fittings and just sending them samples to like their apartments or their homes. And so that's, I guess, another option that, you know, if this quarantine lasts longer, could be another option. But yes, usually we would fit kind of very similar to this, but ideally with a fit model live. Grab some more pins. So this is just a t-shirt, a cheaper t-shirt, basic. And I won't mention the brand, but a basic cheap t-shirt. I don't know, some things I could see right away, despite the fact that we don't have a sleeve arm form here, is that once you do have an armhole, or excuse me, once you do have an arm in your armhole here, there's a lot of pulling. There's some pulling definitely at the bust level that's creating some drag lines here. Some people are not very picky about their t-shirt fit because it's such a throw-on item. But if you're designing something that's meant to be like a nicer fit t-shirt, something that people are going to keep in their closet, maybe it's organic cotton and it's going to last a long time. It's not, a fast fashion type of a fit. This is a common area. If we just shorten up the front a little bit, that removes a lot of these drag lines and also the pull that was happening. I'll pull it down again. A lot of the pull that was happening from between the bust and the armhole here is just shortening your front length. And so that doesn't change your neckline at all, or even where your shoulder is hitting, but I'm taking out about an inch total of material here. And that's helping this relax and not have so much pull at the underarm. A lot of times cheap t-shirts, if you dissect them, pull them apart, or even just measure them, you'll find that like the front and the back high point shoulder lengths are exactly the same, or that their armholes are exactly the same front to back, and then there's not really like a definition or a forward facing shoulder. But I think with a lot of the smaller brands I'm working with are, more concerned about the quality and the fit. So that's something we want to pay attention to. So already we can see this is laying a lot more smoothly at the side seam. There is some pulling kind of at this back neck. It might be something where I want to raise the back neck level to get rid of some of that. this is pretty tight across her hips, then maybe we want to like slash it and add some girth to the back circumference so that it lays more smoothly. In this case, we can decide whether we want to add it equally as a full circumference at the hip or if it's mainly in the back. In this case, because her side seam is pretty balanced, I'd say it's mostly in the back, but it's too tight. But you can play with that just by kind of moving it around and seeing, okay, does that help with more? Or if the side seam, let's say if the side seam is pulling a lot forward from her true side seam, then we would want to add to the front. Another thing I see a lot, because with t-shirts especially, is that sometimes the blocks are made from a woven, and so you end up with this kind of pointy shoulder problem. And the best way is to redraft the sleeve and just give it a shallower sleeve cap. But you can also adjust that a little bit by changing the slope of the shoulder a little bit. Again, this would be something we want to recut because pinching it kind of creates this extra bubble that wasn't there before. But we can kind of see, even when it's relaxed, the seam has some puckering. So it means the sleeve is way too tight. Even she without an arm, it's kind of pulling straight across. So those are some common t-shirt things. Want to pay attention, of course, to how your neckline is laying. If the seams are flat, clean, things like that. Talking about different types of top stitching. Some people try to do t-shirts where their neckline binding is the self fabric. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. On a V-neck, you probably could get a pretty smooth neckline, but on a crew neck, if you're using the self fabric instead of like a 1x1 rib, for example, your t-shirt will kind of curl out and kind of ripple, bacon edge, lettuce edge, that type of thing. So we want to make sure using the correct materials when possible. Any quick t-shirt questions?
We didn't have any specific questions come in from the t-shirt, but I'll jump into this one that came in from Alessandra. So a lot of you guys had sent questions in advance, so I'm going to jump to those first, and then we'll go to the few more that came in live. But Alessandra asks, what are common mistakes and signs to look for and best ways to tell if it's a sewing issue or a pattern issue? I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, but can you expand or clarify?
Sure. So a lot of times, especially if you notice an issue and it's one side of the garment versus the other, that can often be a sewing thing. That's not to say that's the only time it's a sewing issue. I always recommend talking to your sample maker, and that goes to whether it's your pattern maker who made the sample or whether it's someone else that made the sample, to see what issues they came across. Maybe they had trouble with a binding piece that wasn't the right length and they had to stretch it, or other times it's good when you measure your garment before the fitting, you'll see things that are off spec or if they look funny. A lot of times that's to do with sewing, which may or may not be also a pattern problem. So sometimes they're both. Sometimes you can fix a sewing error by more training in the sewing. Sometimes you can fix a sewing error by changing the pattern, making it easier to construct. And that's why it's important to talk to the sample maker and find out, like, why did they have this problem? Did they have suggestions? Especially a sample maker who's been doing it a long time probably would have some suggestions on how to fix it. Sometimes there's material issues where, especially on like a knit or a very drapey fabric, that something stretches out, or if it's cut off grain, you can take a closer look at that and say, like, why is the side seam doing this funny thing? Is it something we have to pay attention to in cutting? Is it something we have to change the design to accommodate, to make it look how we want it to look? And it's kind of a troubleshooting process between the technical team, the factory or the sample maker, and your pattern maker. So this is kind of a more drapey style. It's a chambray top. This is just something I bought at the store. It's really cute design idea, but even when it was pressed out, when this is on a person especially, it kind of pops out at the neck. Try to get a little close up. So it's kind of a crossed over design. And in order to get it to lay flat, we really have to like kind of dig into this neckline and pull. However it was draped, there's like excess material under here and also up here. So even when you press it, you never really get a smooth shape here. So this one, ideally we could take it apart completely. And I probably will in order to be able to alter it. But I want to start with the underlayer. And anytime you have like pieces that are crossing over, if it's like a pleat or a draped design, like starting closest to the body, is always going to be the best way to address the problem. Sometimes addressing the underlying problem will help the top layer fix itself. Other times, you know, that helps. The bottom layer is definitely laying more smoothly by just taking some length out of that center front at the neck. But this top layer, probably because this is a symmetrical pattern, even though it looks slightly asymmetrical. If we do the same adjustment here, removing some of that length from that folded line here at the neck. And pinching out until wherever we feel like that 0 point is, where the blend point is. You can see, like, as I'm pinching this, it's almost excess material all the way to the shoulder because it's creating this little bubble. So I'm gonna pinch that out. And sometimes we'll adjust our pins a little bit, one direction, the other, so that we get a nice, smooth, flying pins, smooth shape here. I definitely took out more on this side than I did the other side. The other side, the pinch kind of at that center front seemed to be enough. But now, if we lay that back down, that looks a lot cleaner. I guess this is another good thing to mention too. I don't remember if I did earlier, but make sure your samples are pressed really nicely before you fit them, because sometimes a pressing issue or like a sewing tension issue that can be pressed out will make you think you need to adjust the pattern, but you might not need to. It might just be, you know, able to be fixed there. So this is kind of obviously a baggier type of a style. So we're not adding darts or doing anything there. Looks good across the shoulder. We'll check the back. Has a little cutout detail. Depending on how, I don't know, how fitted or something you want this garment. I mean, certainly we could take some out of the side seam to remove some of this drag, but maybe it's supposed to be a little bit oversized. So some of those are, you know, design fit decisions. You know, fit is so subjective, designer to designer and style to style. You have to decide, you know, what's going to be a good fit. And also remembering that you're making a custom, or not making a custom garment for your fit model, but that you're making a garment, you know, for the masses. And so sometimes that, you know, 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch is important. Other times you might decide, you know what, this fits well enough, especially in like a later prototype, for example, if you're in 3rd round, 4th round, and still nitpicking little things, it might be a good time to ask yourself, how important are these changes? I've had some situations where designers just want to keep going and keep fitting and keep fitting. because they're trying to get kind of like perfect kind of custom fit on the fit model. But then if you switch a fit model or you do size run test and now you're testing it on multiple bodies, now, you know, each person's body is going to be a little bit different, even if they're the same size. So knowing kind of when to stop is a good thing too.
Yeah, so Zhuang asks, kind of on that note, how do you determine the right fit, especially if your client is the one who's trying the item on, or even different fit models have different sizes. So what's your call on that?
I think you want to decide what are your key points of fit. I always think, I mean, people look at each other's faces, so the neck, the shoulder is very important. From there down, it's very subjective because yes, like there's a good place to put a dart. You don't want a dart that's, you know, down at your waist. It needs to be like definitely pointing towards the apex and things like that. But at the same time, something could be oversized and still fit well, or it could be tight and still fit well if that's your brand standard. Whereas someone else could be looking at it and say like, that's too tight, it does not fit. So it's important to decide what your standards are. Maybe write that down, make it very clear to you and your design team, like what you're looking for. Because that's another thing too in fitting is you want to make sure it's not too many cooks in the kitchen, too many voices. Fit models can be great for the feedback, but then I don't know, I recommend people not using like friends or family because they might have good feedback sometimes, but they also might get, I don't know, too emotionally or personally involved in the fit process or change your mind on things that maybe you felt like you were very clear on, but because you have this voice asking for different things than your design intent, that changes the course of the fitting and the course of how you develop the garment.
Yeah, some great points. Okay, so a few questions that had come in advance. Nilushi asks, how do you decide and what advice do you have on stitch types to be used for each garment? And do you need to do that for each garment?
So yes, definitely this would be something you talk about with your designer, tech designer beforehand. There are certain things that you might decide to skip in the first prototype, some top stitching, for example, see how the fabric reacts and then add top stitching, or maybe you want to see it in the real fabric before you decide if the stitching should be, you know, contrast or matching thread, and it's easier to kind of skip it in the first round. But it should be a conversation you have. Doing seam tests is something I recommend, like instead of necessarily doing it to an entire prototype, take your real fabric, test out the different machines, because there's different ways to accomplish the same things. There's some standards, of course, for, you know, knits that you are probably going to use overlock seams and cover stitched hems, things like that. But that's not to say you couldn't do that on a woven necessarily. There's, I'd say not a lot of hard and fast rules with construction. I mean, there's certainly like more accepted standards, but I think testing it and also taking a look at what other people are doing, especially at your price point. You can construct a shirt 5 different ways. Some are more expensive than others, so it depends on your price point as well.
Okay, great point. So Raquel had asked, what are important checkpoints for me to address when fitting larger bust size on standard sizes? For example, a size 4 with a D cup versus a B, and so on.
So things I would pay close attention to are, of course, the dart. You want to make sure that like your upper body, so your upper chest above the bust, is not becoming too large. I think that's a common thing that can happen in pattern making if you don't have a measurement for above the bust, but you have a full bust and maybe you have a rib cage measurement, but you don't have an upper chest, that it becomes really baggy sort of up here. I'm not very large busted, so not a good example, but that it becomes too baggy up here, or that your shoulder ends up getting too big. This is very style dependent too. I've done some like bras and sports bras for larger busted but smaller rib cage women, and kind of paying attention to how the side seam is. If it's If it's a knit, maybe we curve it out because we're not using darts, but paying close attention to like the various relation between not just the full bust, but the rib cage and the upper chest.
Great points. Okay, so Jenny asks, I'm going to produce my first collection, but I'm not sure about the sampling and fitting process. Do I make a sample on a mannequin and from this one do the fitting on someone to get the ideal fit and send it to the pattern maker? Or do I need to do the fittings after I receive the sample from the sewing company and from this one do the necessary changes?
Okay, so assuming this person's doing their own patterns, possibly, yes, you can make your own pattern, drape it on the mannequin, do your first fit that way. I recommend, like, if at all possible, and if you have the budget for it, or if you're your own fit model, which some people are, I don't recommend it, but a lot of people are, and that's okay, you know, for budgetary reasons, especially with startups, or if you feel confident and comfortable being your own fit model, that's okay. A lot of my clients do it. But having someone else fit on you. I actually had to volunteer myself as a fit model for fitting recently because we obviously were in quarantine and it's difficult to fit on a model. So I fit on the mannequin, but then also threw the garment on myself and had my assistant video in to take the notes because, fitting on yourself is very difficult, but it's possible. But I guess going back to the process, I like to start with real fabric if at all possible. Sometimes we use muslin or placeholder fabric, but I like to start with the real fabric because you're going to see how it's reacting to your design and how it's reacting to the pattern. Muslin, to me, it's okay to use. It's sort of like an extra prototype because it gives me limited information. So going forward with your real fabric or a very close placeholder is best. Get that pattern maker, whether that's you or the professional, involved right away. I have had people come with like a prototype they made, but then there's no pattern, and really it's about the same to me as receiving a sketch because I've still got to, start from scratch, essentially. I can take the measurements and kind of the visual elements, but I'm still starting a pattern from scratch. So start with your pattern, start with your tech pack first and then your pattern.
Great, thank you. Michelle asks, how many different size dress forms do you have and how do you deal with fitting a sample that does not match a dress form size that you keep in your studio?
So in my home studio, I've got 2 mannequins. I've got this one, which is basically a 2-4. And then I have a plus size mannequin who is a 1X or like a 16, 18. I have access to other mannequins if I need them, but for the most part, since we are working with live models, each designer has a little bit different fit, even if they're using a similar size. So we rely on that versus the mannequin. The mannequin's nice to be able to like put it on and kind of see obvious issues, but it doesn't really replace a real person.
Great, thank you. I love this one from Phyllis. How do you fix camel toe?
Probably one of the hardest question or the hardest like fit areas, but depending on the garment. So if it's like a legging, we'll start with like a basic kind of legging, fixing camel toe. Most often is because the front crotch curve has too much material, and so it kind of bubbles and it's not flattering. And so it's shaving off from your center front crotch curve and making sure that there is a good underside of the curve. I wish I'd printed a pattern to hold up, but to make sure you actually have a curve. Usually it's because the front crotch is too straight, and that's why it's creating the camel toe. Other times there's the opposite issue where you're like kind of getting a wedgie type fit in the back and it's pulling fabric forward. And it's because the back crotch curve doesn't have enough depth or curve to it either. A lot of times if you're not experienced in pants and pants fitting, people want to add material versus drop or vice versa. And like more material or adding like height into your curve adds more material. It actually allows it to relax and fall away from the body. versus like scooping out your removing material. So you have to think about it kind of backwards.
Great, thank you. I know that's something.
That could be like a whole demonstration on itself.
Yeah, that could be we could do a whole live on Camel Toe.
Yes.
Bring a glass of wine for that one.
Right.
Okay. Dahlia asks, what is your suggestion in fitting a garment with many alterations, except the fabric is too delicate and you want to avoid puncture holes, I think, by pinning it?
Okay. In that case, you might want to, like, let's say it's an expensive fabric as well as a delicate fabric. Maybe you want to find something that is, let's say it's a silk chiffon. Maybe you find a polyester chiffon to do your first sampling in so that your prototyping is less expensive overall. You're not using $20 yard fabric, you're using $5 yard fabric, for example. It's hard to get away from you have to do a prototype in it eventually, so you will have to pin into it. I'd say in that case, probably staying away from the safety pins because they're usually thicker diameter for the pin itself, like definitely using like a silk, very delicate pin, and then removing them immediately after the fitting. Like maybe you're marking it with tape or with chalk so that the pins aren't there long term and you can kind of steam out the holes.
Great, thank you, Xochil. Okay, Marco asks, if you're in charge of all aspects of the garment and you make the muslin and then fit it and make the changes, do you make a completely new muslin with the new measurements for the second muslin, or do you try your best to make those fit changes on the original muslin?
Most of the time, I'd say like 99% of the time, we're making a completely new prototype, whether that's muslin or whether that's fabric. And the main reason is that when you're taking anything away, so already when you sew the first garment, like you're cutting away some seam allowance, maybe when you're serging or doing a top stitch, or maybe you've clipped into the neckline to let it smooth out, like you've changed the original material. So when you're undoing stitches, you're potentially causing snags, you're pulling the material, adding stress to it. And it takes almost as long to undo something, especially when you're undoing lots of things, as it is to just recut a brand new garment. So I think it's more accurate and more, time efficient to just cut a new one, sew a new one. And then you also have a point of comparison where you can retry that first garment and compare it to the second garment. Because you really shouldn't be getting rid of your prototypes until you're done. That way, if you do need to revisit something, you can.
Great, thank you. And then also just an add-on question from Marco. Do you usually not include seam allowance in your hems?
I like to finish the garment. So sometimes in the very first prototype, we would do an unfinished garment, but yes, otherwise I would include seam allowance. If we weren't hemming it, I would press it up at least, or add just a stitch line. But yeah, I think it's best to hem it.
Great. And you guys, we can do a couple more questions. Otherwise, I do have to scoot in a few minutes to take care of my kiddo. But Jenny asks, how many prototypes and fittings are usually needed to produce a garment?
So I'd say that varies brand to brand. It also depends on whether this is your first collection and you have no blocks that you're starting from versus someone who has a few seasons in their belt and we're starting from a previously proved pattern. So let's say it's your first collection. I'd say the average is between 3 to 5 rounds per garment. Because you're establishing a fit, it's the first time you're working with a given fabric or a given style. You and your pattern maker are also getting to know one another because your fit is going to be a little bit different. Your designs are a little bit different than someone else's. But I'd say once you have that first season down, usually 3 and sometimes fewer. It really depends on like how many design changes there are from a block or how fitted the garment is. Something like swimwear or activewear that's very tight to the body, you might be like more attuned to like the very tiny details versus something that is maybe a little more oversized or blousy or kind of loose fitting, then you might have fewer revisions because you're not trying to get so tight to the body.
Great, thank you. Odalis asks, is there a different approach when doing a custom fit for an individual?
I'd say in that case, I mean, you're obviously making less different choices in terms of like how much to take something in or not, and paying closer attention to what your customer, meaning the fit model, wants. Because again, when you're fitting on a fit model for a mass market, you want it to fit them well, but you also want to, make sure it also fits someone else well, and that you're not taking it too tight or doing things that would not work necessarily on a different person if like their shoulder slope were slightly different or their bust is a half inch different and you have a range. When you're working on a custom fit, you're definitely obviously listening to that customer and how tight or how loose and how comfortable they are with different features. If you're not planning to remake it, you might not need to like change that back to the pattern so many times. You might need to like your muslin fitting, adjust the pattern, cut it in real fabric, and now you're making all those changes just to the garment like a tailor would, and not necessarily putting it back to the pattern.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to throw one more question in, and then I do need to wrap up. But Raquel asks, what are the general changes made when adjusting patterns for petite or tall sizes? Are there standard measurements that are used across the board?
I'd say paying attention to obviously your vertical measurements, so like your back to waist level on a, I don't know, average sized person, let's say a female who's 5'5", 5'6", 5'4", in that range, about 15 inches. But on a petite, maybe it's 13 inches, maybe on a tall person, it's 17 inches. So we want to pay attention to those lengths, not only from your neck to your waist, that's one example, but your high point shoulder to waist, to hip, to floor, to knee. You want to pay more close attention to where those points are. And other than that, I mean, you're still treating it kind of a similar way. It's still, the human body is similar in different ways, just different girth measurements, different length measurements.
Great, thank you, Xochil. To wrap up, a couple of people are asking, how can we learn more about fitting from Xochil? Great way to wrap up the session.
I guess you can follow my Instagram, which is Fashion Xochil. You can go to my website, xochil.com, it's XOCHIL.com, or the Chicago Pattern Maker also goes there. Work to, take a look at your stuff and help you with your quick questions if you need help.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Xochil. This was super fun. Yeah, you guys, everybody, please follow Xochil on Instagram. She is quite active and very engaged. And I did misspeak earlier. Her podcast episode is not live. It has been recorded because I recorded a lot of episodes before Errol was born. As you can imagine, recording podcasts with a newborn didn't sound like a great idea. So we recorded it a while ago, but it's coming out in June, so about 2 months. So watch for that. And thank you so much. Tons of thank yous coming in the chat. Looks like everybody really loved this.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun.
Super cool. Thank you so much. And for everybody here, the recording will just be automatically added to my YouTube channel. Just look for Heidi, SEWHEIDI, to get to the YouTube, and it will automatically be there. And thank you so much for coming. It was awesome to see you guys all.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Happy Tuesday. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Bye.
Bye.